Thanks to all of you for being here tonight and joining us. I'm John Aasp. I'm the gallery director for the RIT College of Art and Design, which includes RIT City Art Space, which is located in the historic Sibley building at Liberty Pole Plaza in downtown Rochester, New York. We're really thrilled to be hosting an installation of Untitled LA. This is a work of art by the late Felix Gonzalez-Torres, currently on view at City Art Space, and it will be on view through February 21st of 2021. This installation is made up of thousands of pieces of individually wrapped green candies spilled neatly on the floor. And viewers are able to take a piece of this candy if you visit it in person. So I encourage you to visit City Art Space. We are currently open to the public Thursday through Sunday, 1 to 5 p.m. Admission is always free. And so I hope you get a chance to visit the space and encounter this work in person, because it's a pretty unique experience. But just in case you haven't seen it, I'm going to share a quick little time lapse here of the work being installed and being sort of manifested. Tonight is going to be the first of 4 online discussions we have planned in connection with this installation. And I'm going to be introducing our special guest, Dr. Nico Vicario, in just a moment, who's going to be presenting an introduction to Felix Gonzalez-Torres in his well-known candy spill works. But before we get started, I just want to take a moment to give thanks to some important folks who've made all of this possible. This work by Felix Gonzalez-Torres is jointly owned by Art Bridges and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. And this project is made possible by the generous support of Art Bridges, which loans these works of art from its collection to museums and art spaces all across the country, allowing more audiences to see these important works, but also helping support educational programs like this one, sparking dialogue and connectivity with its collection of art. So I want to say thanks very much to the staff of Art Bridges for their support and help with our efforts here. I also want to thank Stephanie Rankin, the Director of Foundation Relations of RIT, who spearheaded our relationship with Art Bridges and has been shepherding this project, along with my colleague and collaborator, Julie Decker, Associate Professor and Director of the Museum Studies Program in the College of Liberal Arts at RIT, who has been instrumental in developing this project and the associated programming. Also helping us co-host and share this event this evening are Aaron Garland in the marketing department in the RIT College of Art and Design, whose support has helped make tonight possible. And finally, I want to say thanks to the Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation for their collaboration as well with us on this project. And so now I'm going to turn it over and introduce our guest presenter for the evening, Dr. Nico Vicario, who is currently Assistant Professor of Art and the History of Art at Amherst College, and received his PhD from MIT, along with a master's from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. Dr. Vicario is the author of Hemispheric Integration, Materiality, Mobility, and the Making of Latin American Art, published by the University of California Press in 2020. We approached Dr. Vicario to speak about Felix Gonzalez-Torres primarily because of his philosophy of teaching art from a transnational perspective, focusing on how modern and contemporary art is entangled with political and economic processes, but ultimately asking these sort of basic questions. How does the work of art operate in the world, and how does the world operate in the work of art? And so, Dr. Vicario, thanks very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks to John and Julie for the opportunity to speak today, and thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks also to Holly McHugh at the Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation for help with accessing resources and images and being extremely generous. Preparing for this talk has been an opportunity for me to delve more deeply into Felix Gonzalez-Torres' work, and it's been very rewarding to me in the process. My goal today is to speak for about 40 minutes, introducing some aspects of the artist's work and talking a bit about different ways other people have written about it. A lot of people have written about the artist's work, and also contributing some ideas of my own. And I'm going to zero in on the relationship between pleasure and the particular economy of a candy spill like Untitled LA. And indeed, I want to think about this work as an economy and in relationship to the economy of which it is a part. I also want to think about how this work can make us think and feel in the same breath. This relates to the concept of affect, defined by Gregory Seaworth and Melissa Gregg as, quote, the ebbs and swells of intensities that pass between bodies. Here, Gonzalez-Torres understood the body, how Gonzalez-Torres understood the body is far from straightforward. And so we also have to think about the relationship between people and things within our culture, not least our reliance on things so as to feel. I'm going to gather these ideas in relation to the interlocked concepts of regulation and deregulation. You can see my use of parentheses is mimicking Gonzalez-Torres' use of parentheses in the titles of his works. And how regulation and deregulation operate on a number of levels. And all the while, I want to keep orbiting around this pile of green candies in plastic wrappers currently installed in Rochester, though I'll represent the work with images of a number of different installations of the work. So the work might look very different from image to image, but that's part of the logic of the work, its circulation. So I say installed in Rochester rather than on view in Rochester for two reasons. Firstly, because this work is designed to do more than be viewed. You're invited to take a candy from the pile and eat it, whether while still in the gallery or elsewhere at a point in the future. So an element of this work might sit in your pocket or your bag, might rest on your bedside table, might melt in the sun or melt in your mouth. Do you like the work of Gonzalez-Torres? There's no accounting for taste. I also emphasized installation because it suggests roles played by people other than the artist in deciding how the work is presented, something I'll return to a bit later on. But I know from talking to John that decisions could be made regarding the shape of the candy pile and where in the room the candies were arranged and how. Other elements were predetermined by the artist before his death through certificates of authenticity that provided criteria for the work's presentation. And these were reinforced by the artist's foundation, like the color of the candies, their wrappers, their flavor as sour apple, and the supplier. So some of you may be wondering, is this art? Which is a common enough question in the history of modern and contemporary art. So for instance, over 100 years ago, Marcel Duchamp put common everyday objects as a urinal on display in the gallery and deemed them works of art. Duchamp called these ready-mades, and they have been interpreted in a number of ways. On the one hand, Duchamp challenged what art can be by appropriating a banal everyday object and calling it a work of art. At the same time, he drew attention to the conditions that make something a work of art. For instance, an artist claiming it as such, a museum or other exhibition space that exhibits it, and so on. But perhaps less commonly dwelled upon, and in line with my thinking today for this presentation, is that Duchamp drew attention to the aesthetic qualities of the found object or ready-made. So by presenting it as a work of art in a museum, he brought up the question of its beauty. So we can see the ready-made as taking art off its pedestal and de-aestheticizing it, or we can see the ready-made as elevating the status of the mass-produced object to the level of a work of art, asking us to take it as seriously, or both. Important to this presentation is that Felix Gonzalez-Torres believed that works of art were open to interpretation, and not just one, but many interpretations. So as you might know, Duchamp was not the last artist in the 20th century to blur the lines between the mass-produced thing and the work of art. So beginning in the 1960s in New York, Andy Warhol used familiar objects and brands like Campbell's Soup as part of what became known as pop art. And it was pop art, often representing a can of soup worth less than $1, that would in turn sell for millions of dollars, collapsing, conflating, and turning inside out the relationship between the cheap and the expensive, the mass and the elite commodity. The market for contemporary art is the legacy of this, and some of you might take interest in the fact that Gonzalez-Torres' Untitled LA was sold at auction for over $7 million in 2015. How could a pile of candies cost so much? The play with and manipulation of value by artists like Duchamp and Warhol earlier in the 20th century provides a partial genealogy. Also in the 1960s, artists who became known as the minimalists engaged with the aesthetics of mass production, as was the case with Donald Judd, whose specific objects are currently on view or installed at the Museum of Modern Art, often outsourcing the production of the works to third parties like Bernstein Brothers, shown here, located a short distance away in downtown New York. Similarly, silkscreen prints like the Campbell Soup series by Warhol were made by the artist's assistants in Warhol's factory. Likewise, in the 1960s, we can find precedents for Gonzalez-Torres' interests in participation, tactile engagement, and circulation, all challenges to the idea of the work of art as a static, untouched object to be viewed from a distance in the exhibition space. For instance, in Brazil, Lygia Clark created works of art that the public was invited to manipulate. If we think about the hand, that's the root of the word manipulate. Her friend Oiticica created parangoles designed to be worn by people out on the street in Rio. Another artist from Brazil, Cildo Morelos, created a project called Insertions into Ideological Circuits at the end of the 1960s during the military dictatorship in that country. Here, art was understood to circulate as messages on found objects that move between people, such as Coca-Cola bottles and paper money. The ready-made was now not on display in the museum, but understood as a vehicle for communication. Something similar characterized mail art, an art practice that used the postal system as a means of mobilizing and decentering art away from particular cultural hubs, away from the museum or gallery, away from a singular site, and away from its status as commodity or discrete object. The 1960s also saw the emergence of conceptual art, in which emphasis was placed more on the artist's idea or the public's experience rather than on the physical object. Some conceptual artists were interested in making art outside of the market, while others found ways to sell works of art taking unconventional forms. So for instance, when you purchase a wall drawing by Sol LeWitt, you purchase the right to have the work drawn according to the artist's instructions. A certificate allows you to have those lines drawn on a wall at your discretion, as well as painted over and redrawn in another time or in another place. This too proves relevant to Gonzalez-Torres' understanding of what and where and when and how the work of art exists. Gonzalez-Torres was born in Cuba in 1957 as the Cuban Revolution was beginning, before emigrating to Spain with his grandparents, then heading to study art in Puerto Rico and then moving to New York. In the late 1980s, he joined the politically oriented art collective group Material, though he's best known for works like Untitled LA, which he produced on his own. Once he began exhibiting his work, some people sought to pigeonhole him as a Latin American or Latino artist with a particular stereotype surrounding those identities in New York at the time. As he put it in one interview, quote, "As Hispanic artists, we're supposed to be very crazy and colorful, extremely colorful. We're supposed to feel, not think. I'm not a good token. I don't wear the right colors. I have my own agenda. Some people want to promote multiculturalism as long as they are the promoters, the circus directors. We have an assigned role that's very specific, very limited." This became grounds for what queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz termed Gonzalez-Torres' particular disidentifications. For Gonzalez-Torres, it was important to note that it was not just Latin American writers like Borges and Garcia Marquez whose work inspired and informed his art. Rather, he would cite Gertrude Stein, Sigmund Freud, Guy Debord, Walter Benjamin, Frantz Fanon, Louis Althusser, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and others as imagined interlocutors, saying, quote, "These ideas move me to a place of pleasure through knowledge and some understanding of the way reality is constructed, of the way the self is formed in culture. I'm a person who lives in the society, and I'm a product of the society in this culture. I'm that culture itself." So I want to focus on the idea of pleasure in the quotation. Why would the way reality is constructed, the way the self is formed by culture, being a product of this society and culture, ideas that often make people skeptical, disenchanted, disempowered, why would all this move him to a place of pleasure? I'd like to connect this back to Gonzalez-Torres' frustration with the stereotype of Hispanic artists. We are supposed to feel, not think. I want to argue with that a work like Untitled LA might be interpreted as a way of synthesizing feeling and thinking, related to the pleasure of being a cultural product, to paraphrase the artist. And I'll do this by zeroing in on two things that I think have been, for the most part, neglected in writing about Gonzalez-Torres' candy spills that I've come across. So one is the effect of eating the candy, and two, its synthetic surfaces, the shiny plastic wrappers. Here I draw loosely from the field of affect theory to think about how ideas, politics, economics, feeling, aesthetics might all be available to us in a single candy, in this case, the sour apple candy and the plastic wrapper glinting under artificial light. For most people writing about the artist's work, it's been important to know that Felix Gonzalez-Torres was gay and that his partner Ross Laycock died of AIDS in 1991, and that the artist himself died of AIDS in 1996. If Latino artists were thought to feel, not think, queer artists were often defined in relation to sex. The culture wars of the late 1980s and early 1990s, not least relating to controversies surrounding public funding for art, inform interpretations of Gonzalez-Torres' candy spills, such as Untitled LA, as covertly sexual. While in the late 1980s and early 1990s, some other artists, many of them queer, courted prejudice and censorship with graphic depictions of sex or visceral displays of blood and other bodily fluids, Gonzalez-Torres' works were designed to avoid controversy. Indeed, the artist was interested in circumventing both censorship and marginalization. But despite their relative timidity, Robert Storr claimed that the artist's candy spills evoke oral sex. The idea of children taking candy from a stranger also comes up in a few texts, implying that Gonzalez-Torres' candy spills conjure the image of the artist as a gay pedophile. Others suggest that taking the candy into one's body evoked the contraction of HIV, that the candy would symbolically carry the virus and infect the public. Performance studies scholar Joshua Chambers-Letson has made a connection between Gonzalez-Torres' use of contracts, the certificates of authenticity noted earlier, and the contraction of a virus, contraction. That Gonzalez-Torres himself enjoyed and made good use of double entendres supports such interpretations. Gonzalez-Torres himself said in one interview, "I want to be like a virus that belongs to the museum or to the institution." And Jonathan Katz has extended this metaphor, understanding the museum not just as a host, implying both hospitality and a body open to infection, but also as an immune system. So what does it mean to be a virus that belongs to the museum? It's different than saying one is infecting the institution, though it's of course that too. It's to be owned by the museum as property, but so too is to belong an intimate relation of inclusivity for one. In Gonzalez-Torres' work, it's difficult to parse these distinctions, and in any case, his work is not about parsing, it's about conflation. Gonzalez-Torres did not seek to privilege a particular interpretation of the work or shut others down. And I, for one, in the past couple of weeks, started to think about the piles of candies in relationship to the condoms distributed for free during the height of the AIDS crisis in this country, plastic-wrapped giveaways distributed in bulk. Consider Jenny Holzer's work from the early 1980s using condom wrappers as the medium. Such interpretations, whether or not they mirror the artist's own thinking, contribute to the richness of the work, its mutation and survival. But it is important to note, I think, that in an interview with Ross Bleckner in 1995, Gonzalez-Torres insisted, "I don't make work about being gay." Some writers focus less on sex acts and viruses as tacit elements of the artist's work and more on the relationship of the private and the public. At times, the artist said that the public he designed for was a single person, Ross. At other times, he talked about redistributing the work to a larger public. On the relationship between public and private in the artist's work, writers often cite, as Gonzalez-Torres did himself, the Bowers versus Hardwick Supreme Court ruling in 1986, that what happens in the bedroom is the business of the state to legislate, suggesting there is no private realm that is not policed by the government. Gonzalez-Torres choosing to show a photograph of his own bed on a billboard in various outdoor locations could be seen to blur or mix up the most literally private space, bedroom, with the most literally public space, street, getting at the public of public art, as it's most often defined by the art world as things that are shown outside. But in interviews, Gonzalez-Torres chafed against this impoverished understanding of public art. Indeed, he put pressure on the ways in which we define the private, saying in an interview with Bob Nickus, "We're really talking about private property because there is no private space anymore." As he said to Robert Storr, all spaces are private, you have to pay for everything. As he explained to Joseph Kosuth, people can buy these billboards, but they have to put them in public. They have to rent a public space. Given this muddied boundary between private and public, the role of renting and buying what one might logically imagine would be free of charge, he reasoned that a work of art in a museum or gallery, like Untitled LA, could be viable as a form of public art, even when encountered in privately owned spaces. The notion of the candy spill as public art has led some writers to interpret a work like Untitled LA as democratic or based in generosity. For instance, Russell Ferguson has interpreted the economy of a Felix Gonzalez-Torres candy spill in relationship to the economy at large. Quote, this economy might seem utopian, and in a way it is, but Gonzalez-Torres was always as much a materialist as an idealist. He was fully aware of harsher economies too. The giving away of candy has a synectical and opposed relationship to the broader economy. It proposes another model, but does not deny the continuing existence of a dominant system predicated precisely on the artificial scarcity that the candy spill resists. So I want to delve more deeply into this dominant system as Gonzalez-Torres saw it. As he noted in the interview with Kosuth, in America, for every dollar we spend on welfare, we spend $6 to bail out the savings and loans. The Republicans were going to eliminate the deficit, and they tripled it. They changed the priorities of our economy and our society. Take their military complex. In 1980, for every dollar we spent on housing, we spent $6 on the military. Reflecting back a few years later on living in Los Angeles in 1990, he characterized the moment thus: trickle-down economics, a rise in cynicism, growing racial and class tension, and the widening gap between the very rich and the rest of us, a time of defunding vital social programs, the abandonment of the ideals on which our country was supposedly founded. Indeed, Gonzalez-Torres began making his candy spills at a very specific moment in history and in economic policy during the rise of what is now commonly known as neoliberalism. For the purposes of this presentation, I want to emphasize the aspects of that moment characterized by deregulation of financial markets and the abdication of authority from the state to private corporations. While Gonzalez-Torres was critical of the dominant system, Ferguson's term, he also sometimes appeared to echo its logic. In the interview with Rollins, given soon after the end of the Cold War, Gonzalez-Torres said, "I've been waiting for the revolution for a long time, and it hasn't come. The ones that have come have done very little to change our ways. Therefore, I don't want a revolution anymore. It's too much energy for too little, so I want to work within the system." And to Kosuth, money and capitalism are powers that are here to stay, at least for the moment. It's within those structures that change can and will take place. While theorist Bell Hooks understood Gonzalez-Torres's work as an act of resistance, I'm not sure this bears out under scrutiny. Indeed, the flexibility and fluidity of his works, their deregulation, could be interpreted as decidedly neoliberal and thus in step with the dominant system. Gonzalez-Torres's art was ultimately symbiotic with, rather than lethal to, institutions, including the market. This comes to forecast artist Joe Scanlon's address to Gonzalez-Torres's work in the pages of Art Forum in 2010, 16 years after the artist's death. Despite their unusual structure, quote, the works by Felix Gonzalez-Torres continued the smooth flow of everyday objects into prestigious museums and private collections. Scanlon argued that the flexibility, organicism, accessibility, eloquence that characterize Gonzalez-Torres's body of work align with the dominant social order that shares these qualities, or at least aspires to them. For instance, Scanlon considers the similarity between Gonzalez-Torres's work and what he calls the internet economy and its propensity for data mining and crowdsourcing under the guise of user-friendly participation. This interesting, if somewhat strained analogy is echoed, if with less panic, in artist Tino Segal's interview with gallerist and Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation founder Andrea Rosen in 2016, in which Segal suggests, quote, "You could also say Felix's work is an algorithm. An algorithm is always in play. You put some candies on the floor, you put them in an exhibition, and because they're candies, people walk through and take them. And over time, the shape of the thing changes." So it's very difficult to break that algorithm, that process. Now, if you started gluing them to the floor, I think then it would actually not be a Gonzalez-Torres work anymore because you've changed the algorithm. Maybe he is the first algorithmic artist by creating works that change form by itself. Both Scanlon and Segal seek to connect Gonzalez-Torres' work to the internet, but neither seems to connect to the idea of the viral image, the news story, image, or video that goes viral, which would give us a way to think about the circulatory logic of a candy spill in a variety of ways in relationship to the internet. The viral image, story, or video file is implicitly a copy, a series of replicated images circulating. The ready-made candies are likewise replicating copies dispersed through and entering a variety of hosts. So how does all of this weigh on a work like Untitled LA? How can consideration of developments in American culture at the turn of the 1990s, along with a sense of diminishing alternatives to it, with implications for the world as we know it today, how does all this inform our experience of this candy spill? I think the interview with Bob Nick, as I cited earlier, is helpful in this regard. After Nickus alludes to the sexual undertones of sucking a work of art in one of Gonzalez-Torres' candy spills, an interpretation which Gonzalez-Torres permits, the artist then goes on to speak about one candy spill in particular, the USA Today piece. The USA Today piece was a sugar rush. With patriotism, you get really high, very euphoric, but then you come down. I think this deserves some unpacking as it gives us another way of thinking about a work like Untitled LA. But the USA Today candy spill, patriotism is compared to a sugar rush. While the sugar rush is also literal, the sensorial metabolic experience of the visitor who ingests the candy. In Untitled LA, by logical extension, the sugar rush is not the United States, is not patriotism, but it could be the city of Los Angeles, more specifically, notoriously stereotyped as a place of spectacle, of glimmering surfaces, but of surfaces containing nothing, empty, vacuous, the etymological link between surface and superficial. The Emerald City, perhaps. Here, the sour apple flavor of Untitled LA's candies might prove relevant. What does it mean for a taste to be both sweet and sour, maybe to leave a bad taste in one's mouth? Or is the work a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down? And what was the medicine here? What's been interpreted by some writers as the democratic and generous and even empowering aspect of Gonzalez-Torres' candy spills, in fact, involves a high and low affect, what psychiatrists call cycling, and what nutritionists might analyze in relationship to blood sugar. Blood sugar, as a compound noun, conjures the relationship between Gonzalez-Torres' candy and the body, as well as the interaction between the innocent, child-friendly pleasure of candy and the blood that is crucial both to human life and a medium of contagion where the virus lives when we think about HIV. The come down also has a relationship to other drugs. We can think about tolerance and withdrawal and overdose and the incidence of HIV infection with intravenous drug use. If this suggests a relationship between candy and heroin, a few writers have made associations between the candy spills and another type of drug, the AZT pills that became available in the late 1980s as the first to treat HIV and AIDS. So perhaps this is the medicine that the sugar helps go down. The relationship between candy and medication is suggested somewhat more explicitly by one candy spill in particular called Untitled Placebo from 1991, the same year as Untitled LA. In the interview with Nickus, Gonzalez-Torres described placebo as a mean piece. When Nickus asks in disbelief, why is it a mean piece? The artist explained, quote, beautiful things can be very deceiving. That's how most things operate in our culture. They make you feel good for a little while. In the case of taking a placebo, one is not receiving the drug at all. Trick or treat. life or death, luck of the draw, all that glitters is not gold. So how does this idea of Gonzalez-Torres's candy spills as mean pieces, as deceptive works belonging to a deceptive culture that, quote, only makes you feel good for a little while, how does this idea open these works up to new interpretations, distinct from the idea of their generosity noted earlier? Following Charles Meriwether's text about the artist, we can think about anthropologist Marcel Mauss in the early 20th century and his theory of the gift. The way gifts might be understood as producing a form of debt for the recipient. How does this relate to the debt economy analyzed by Gonzalez-Torres in the text quoted a moment ago? Is a candy spill a small pile of debt? And what is the interest rate? Or one could say there's no accounting for taste. Others might suggest that if one eats a sweet from a candy spill installed in a museum, one has usually already paid an admission fee that would more than cover the cost of the single candy. From this vantage point, rather than free, the candy has already been paid for. Or perhaps it functions like an after-dinner mint, free of charge, but given with the leather fold enclosing your bill, your money owed. Accordingly, we can think about the limit to the work's generosity, giving visitors a single candy rather than, say, a square meal at a time of economic recession that began in 1990 and ended in 1991, the same moment, as the artist notes, when social services were being gutted. We might call it Gonzalez-Torres's tokenistic generosity. Indeed, a candy is a token given by an artist who is resisting tokenization. And I think this fits with the mean interpretation of the works noted earlier, the come down after the high, the sour or even bitter after the sweet, the hunger after the few calories appear to satiate but leave one unfulfilled. So too is this high and low, this cycling analogous to the booms and busts of the economy between the 1980s and the recession of the early 1990s in the art world, as well as in the economy at large. So if blood sugar requires regulation, the affective dimensions of late 20th century capitalism were decidedly unregulated, fluctuating systems with high highs and low lows. To consider the psychological dimensions of these systems, one of Gonzalez-Torres's go-tos, Sigmund Freud, has something to add. Quote, in the psychoanalytical theory of the mind, we take it for granted that the course of mental process is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. That is to say that any given process originates in an unpleasant state of tension and thereupon determines for itself such a path that its ultimate issue coincides with a relaxation of this tension, i.e. with the avoidance of pain or with production of pleasure. When we consider the psychic processes under observation in reference to such a sequence, we are introducing into our work the economic point of view. Both Freud and Gonzalez-Torres help us to think about the pleasure as economic, and in relationship to both regulation and deregulation. Perhaps ultimately the generosity of this work is not its meting out as candy bought in bulk, one by one to visitors, but its openness to interpretation. Interpretations the work is able to aggregate, to stockpile. If I've missed some way of thinking about the candy spills, that's precisely the point. I don't control the proliferation of meaning any more than Gonzalez-Torres did. But if we wish to bow to authorial authority, to the author's function as authorizer, to paraphrase Mi-Wan Kwan, we can highlight the instances in which Gonzalez-Torres claimed that works of art contained a multitude of meanings, and more pointedly, those instances in which he spoke about his interest in making work that explored contradictions. The sugar high followed by the low, the deceptive aspect of beauty, that's how most things operate in our culture. I want to dig into this more for the remainder of the talk, namely the feeling, the affective dimension of how most things operate in our culture and how politics, economics, and pleasure are synthesized in Gonzalez-Torres's ready-mades. I've talked about the sugar high and the sugar low, but I also want to talk about the plastic wrappers. And this is to take seriously the artist's own claim that, quote, aesthetics are not about politics, they are politics themselves. I'm understanding aesthetics is not just about works of art, but about sensorial experience more generally. How do we feel when we eat a candy, whether it's a work of art or not? How do we feel when we get election results or when we get a diagnosis? Affect is variable, unpredictable, sometimes inconsistent and fleeting, shimmering. In one interview, Gonzalez-Torres said, quote, "I think I woke up on Monday in a political mood, and on Tuesday in a very nostalgic mood, and Wednesday in a realist mood." Sound familiar? Perhaps these moods we wake up in are themselves a form of regulation. Central to many interpretations of the artist's candy spills are their subtitles, which sometimes link the work to a particular person, most famously Ross, his dying partner in Untitled Portrait of Ross in LA. These works and the interpretations that have been made of them ask us to think about the relationship between particular humans, individuals, and mass-produced candies. The idea of a person as a singular stable entity, a subject, in relation to a pile of objects. Some writers have considered such works in relationship to the transubstantiations of Catholicism, in which the body of Christ becomes the wafer, the blood of Christ becomes the wine. Another approach would be to return to the place of pleasure Gonzalez-Torres found, not least in seeing himself as a product of this society and this culture. Notably, the way in which Gonzalez-Torres measured these portraits was not based on the number of candies, but based on weight, as one would purchase a number of commodities, including meat. We might also go back to Gonzalez-Torres' analysis of neoliberalism to consider the relationship between the defunding of social services and the AIDS crisis, the degree to which certain bodies come to matter, as well as the degree to which people with AIDS would occupy a position of precarity, relying without guarantee on both governments and private corporations, most notably Big Pharma, for their survival through pills. What we might consider as the private-public partnerships characteristic of both neoliberalism, in which power was given by governments to corporations through outsourcing and deregulation, and Gonzalez-Torres' works, which are themselves private-public partnerships of a kind. The plastic. So much has been written and thought and said about Gonzalez-Torres' work, but its visual qualities are often neglected, left unanalyzed, not least because the work isn't just about vision. But I also think that Gonzalez-Torres' use of ready-made suggests to some interpreters that visual effects were less important to him than other concerns. And I want to push against that assumption for the rest of the presentation. Perhaps the green of the candies distinguishes this work from some of Gonzalez-Torres' other works, but he did not insist on the exact hue. It's the sour apple flavor that's specified by the certificate. The wrapper is transparent, but it is what catches the light on its plastic surfaces. It's the form one unwraps and discards to access the candy's content, a content which is also form. But surface has a value too, not least the way it glints and is animated by illumination, as well as by the shifting light effects when the visitor to the gallery moves about the space. Helpful here is Gonzalez-Torres' description of his encounter in Los Angeles in 1990 with a work by the artist Ronnie Horn, the year before making Untitled LA. In the same text in which he chronicled trickle-down economics, growing income inequality, and the dismantling of vital social services, he unexpectedly pivoted from the macro scale to the micro affect, focusing on his encounter with this work by Horn. Quote, 1990, LA, the gold field. How can I deal with the gold field? I don't quite know, but the gold field was there. Ross and I entered the Museum of Contemporary Art, and without knowing the work of Ronnie Horn, we were blown away by the heroic, gentle, and horizontal presence of this gift. There it was in a white room, all by itself. It didn't need company. It didn't need anything. Sitting on the floor, ever so lightly, a new landscape, a possible horizon, a place of rest and absolute beauty, waiting for the right viewer, willing and needing to be moved to a place of the imagination. This piece is nothing more than a thin layer of gold. It is everything a good poem by Wallace Stevens is, precise with no baggage, nothing extra, a poem that feels secure and dares to unravel itself, to become naked, to be enjoyed in a tactile manner, but beyond that, in an intellectual way too. Ross and I were lifted. Gonzalez-Torres also noted that Horn's work conjured for him the golden hour, which he loved, a time in Los Angeles near sunset, characterized by a particular quality of light. But Horn's gold field took that ambient temporal experience and captured it in a commodity taken out of circulation. A couple people writing recently have connected Gonzalez-Torres' work to what is sometimes known as new materialism, which takes seriously the power and agency of things. Fair enough. But in the short time remaining, I want to be more specific. For now, I want to suggest that the beauty of Gonzalez-Torres perceived in Gold Field, a work whose medium is in fact pure gold, survived or became reincarnated in the plastic wrappers of his candy spills, which he began creating the same year he encountered Horn's piece in 1990. Horn's surface was pure gold, Gonzalez-Torres's plastic. Horn's work has no baggage, nothing extra. Gonzalez-Torres's work arguably comes with plenty of baggage and plenty extra. While Horn's work is sitting ever so lightly, Gonzalez-Torres's candy spills are measured by their weight in hundreds of pounds. While Horn's work is delicately intact, Gonzalez-Torres's is designed for atomized dispersion. But there is a continuity here that I think is useful to argue for. How can the mass-produced thing, from another vantage point, so cold and empty, so disposable, superfluous, wasteful, and the thing to unwrap to get to the thing you want, become a vehicle, vessel, trigger, and catalyst of feeling? Is this a sugar high? And if not, what other form of pleasure can we take in this culture of consumption as mediated in Gonzalez-Torres's candy wrappers? What does it mean to take seriously what may have only been articulated casually, off the cuff, when the artist said, "I'm a product"? And how does that bear on Gonzalez-Torres's use of mass-produced products, the plastic-wrapped candies comprising a work like Untitled LA? We might connect these plastic surfaces back to Roland Barthes, one of Gonzalez-Torres's favorite authors, and his writing in 1957 in a short essay on plastic, that the material embodies, quote, "the transmutation of matter." More than a substance, plastic is the very idea of its infinite transformation. As its everyday name indicates, it is ubiquity made visible. Remember that Barthes was one of those writers who meant something to Gonzalez-Torres, who gave him pleasure to identify as a cultural product. In a series of later lectures collected in the book, The Neutral, Barthes, not explicitly referring to plastic, writes that the inventory of shimmers is of nuances, of states, of changes. Barthes was writing these lectures in the midst of a deep depression in the wake of his mother's death, which he notes in the lectures, which we might venture to compare to Gonzalez-Torres, who mourned Ross's passing in 1991. In these lectures, Barthes described the neutral as, quote, "a desire to dissolve one's own image." This desire to dissolve one's own image is also at play in Gonzalez-Torres's candy spills, which simultaneously resisted the conventions of portraiture and embodied a logic of dissolution through the process of depletion, of giving away. So too is this a rhetorical death of the author, to use the phrase coined by Barthes in 1967, anticipating the artist's actual death. A work by Gonzalez-Torres made of cloth curtains was recently included in an exhibition a few years ago at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, an exhibition called The Inventory of Shimmers, inspired by the Barthes quotation above. But I think that the plastic wrappers more clearly provide us with this glinting inventory. Plastic. As he noted in the interview with Bleckner in 1995, the year of his solo exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, Gonzalez-Torres possessed a massive toy collection, hundreds, plastic and rubber toys with big eyes. And slightly later in the same interview, he said, 1990 and 1991 were very rotten years for me. I went to a flea market during this time and was looking through a bag of toys. And the woman said, I was looking at a Mickey Mouse. You can have them all for $5. I brought them home and they made me feel very good. So I figured if I had more, I'd feel better. It didn't really work that way. Bleckner replied, it usually does work that way when you find something that makes you feel good. It's like drugs. People take drugs to feel good. If drugs didn't work, people wouldn't take them. Gonzalez-Torres responded, I took drugs and I liked them, but not anymore. Bleckner pushes him further about why it was such a bleak period in his life in 1990 and 1991. Gonzalez-Torres does not mention the death from AIDS of his partner, Ross Laycock, so dominant in narratives of the artist's life and work and texts that intermingle the two. He said, the world was just closing in, and I was taking sleeping pills the way you take candy, not just at night. The affect related to commodities that promise to and yet fail to make us happy, from toys to candies to pharmaceuticals, or which fail to make us happy for more than a brief moment, once our blood sugar has spiked and then dipped, is a facet not just of the neoliberal turn, but also akin to the idea of cruel optimism developed by theorist Lauren Berlant, who writes, "Cruel optimism names a relation of attachment to compromised conditions of possibility. A relation of cruel optimism exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing." Notably, Berlant identifies cruel optimism as an affective state linked to the gutting of the welfare state, to which Gonzalez-Torres' essays and interviews at the turn of the 1990s also allude. The bitter pill of success, the feeling of getting what you wanted and not being satisfied by it, perhaps not wanting it anymore once you get it, perhaps being part of a system in which you will never get it, a feeling connected to the rather beautiful word disillusionment, an affect perhaps particularly familiar to people my age. I'm the same age the artist was when he sat for this interview with Bleckner. This is illustrated by way of inversion slightly later, when Gonzalez-Torres notes that at the beginning of his career in 1987, I had no money. I had a little tiny studio apartment smaller than this kitchen. I've never been so happy in my whole fucking life. On the occasion of his career peak, vis-a-vis institutional recognition, a solo exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum, and a year before his death at the age of 38, Gonzalez-Torres equates happiness with having less, not more. More time, perhaps, but less square footage and fewer dollars in the bank, works and collections, articles written about him, renown, fame. But that would be to perceive time as a resource, as an exchange value. When asked by Bleckner in 1995 how long he thought he would live, he replied, "That's a very rude question. It's not about time, it's about how life is lived. How rather than how much." This is not revolutionary. In fact, it's a bit sentimental, and there's nothing wrong with that. As writers have noted, and I'm winding down, mortality and its evasion were in fact built into works like Untitled LA. As the artist explained to Rollins, they will always exist because they don't really exist or because they don't have to exist all the time. As he said in an interview with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, just to quote Sigmund Freud, we rehearse our worst fears in order to lessen them, right? So at that time I was losing Ross and I wanted to lose everything in order to rehearse that fear and just confront that fear and maybe learn something from it. So I even wanted to lose the work, this stuff that is very important in my life. I also wanted to learn to let go. Whoever gets them, a collector or a museum or an art handler or an art installer at the gallery, will decide how this piece is installed. I have no say. Once I lose my domains, the piece is on its own and it gets installed, any way the person wants it. The flexibility of the certificates of authenticity themselves could be seen as a permission slip for deregulatory regulation or regulatory deregulation, a rule to not follow other rules. This extends from a key facet of deregulation in the context of neoliberalism, in which paradoxically, governments choose to exercise their power over something by giving it away. As David Harvey and others have argued, the power of private corporations under neoliberalism must be understood as the consequence of government authorities that choose to abdicate their own power, again, a private-public partnership rather than an antagonism. The certificates of authenticity bought and sold as works of art by Gonzalez-Torres often specify an endless supply of candy. Was this endless supply akin to what Barth called the ubiquity made visible of plastic? Ironically, and I think meaningfully, it's the plastic wrapper that gives Gonzalez-Torres' work what some interpreters call a clean aesthetic, an idea of clean that resonates with the now politically incorrect use of the term clean to characterize a person as HIV negative, and by logical extension, a person with HIV as dirty. The plastic literally enables us to eat candy off the floor, while it's nevertheless the polluting material par excellence, ubiquity made visible. How does this endless supply, this ubiquity made visible, relate to a promise of eternal life, of deathless infinite life that things could allegedly buy you? Or perhaps it relates to what Heather Davis has recently called the queer futurity of plastic, a human-produced substance whose toxicity we must learn to live with and which will in turn outlive us. Beyond endless supply and the deregulation permitted by the certificates of authenticity, another way to think about the survivals of Gonzalez-Torres' work is to talk about its resonance in more recent art. From Tanya Bruguera, who substitutes unprocessed sugar cane for plastic wrapped candy on the floor, right? Sugar candy becomes sugar cane in a work titled Untitled, Havana 2000. To Ai Weiwei, whose vast piles of millions of porcelain sunflower seeds evoke the relationship between the individual and the collective under both capitalism and communism. To Yan Vo, whose work manages to imbue found objects with unpredictable affective power. To Tino Segal, quoted earlier, whose work similarly rethinks singularity, multiplicity, and concepts of ownership, among many other artists. We can also think of our own experience of the work, its ongoingness in 2020 in relationship to experiences outside of the gallery, for instance, fear of contagion during the current pandemic of COVID-19, questions of what's transmitted via surfaces and what by aerosolized saliva, and how that might affect both our experience and interpretation of the work. This is not to collapse the differences between AIDS and COVID-19, but to consider the resonances or aggregations, as well as to acknowledge that AIDS is far from sealed in the historical past, but very much alive in the present, which needs to be mentioned. As Gonzalez-Torres said, forms gather meaning from their historical moment. We can consider how this gathering of meaning took place in 1991 when Gonzalez-Torres was living in Los Angeles, the year his partner died, amidst neoliberalization, booms and busts, highs and lows. We can also consider how forms gather meaning at this very historical moment, now. Untitled LA persists in existing in this moment too, and continues to be shaped by it, but this meaning is tied to a shifting affect, to shifting moods. One way to connect is to the loss of life, to the question of mourning, to how we represent the dead and dying, at what scale and in what form, something about which our culture has no consensus in 2020. Another way to consider a work like Untitled LA in relationship to the present moment would be in relationship to the economization of life, as Michelle Murphy puts it, under the current stage of capitalism. When are people turned into and measured as money, as commodities, whose life is worth saving, and why? And how did the moment Gonzalez-Torres was living in which he perceived a shift in government and in society and in culture, that money was unrepentantly valued over human life, that social services were dismantled, how did all of this lay a foundation for our own historical present? And another approach, right, none of them being mutually exclusive, would be to consider pleasure and to take its randomness and irony seriously, the particular synthesis of feeling and thinking, however mortal or fleeting, and where it's located, sometimes in surprising shimmers. Take it while you can. Simple pleasures, cycling blood sugar, wastefulness, endless supply. Thank you.
Nico, thank you so much for that presentation. Extremely in-depth, a lot of detail there. I have a couple of questions coming in the Q&A, but Julie, go ahead with your comment.
Yeah, thanks, John. So Nico, I just wanted to say, it's not really a question, but just to say, John and I had talked about, like, when we were getting ready for this moment and, postponing because of COVID and everything. And we were saying, the challenges of installing this work in a time of COVID and, people not wanting to touch things and people not wanting to get close. And so I was thinking of it from an outcome perspective, right? Like the visitor experience. But what you've just shared tonight is really incredible in terms of thinking about the work so differently in a time of COVID. When you were mentioning the endless supply of candy and the plastic and its ubiquity, and I immediately thought of masks, those disposable masks when you walk into Target or any of these stores, and then you proceed to see those disposable masks everywhere. They're becoming ubiquitous. And so I was immediately like connecting with that. And the way that you were talking about the meaning of the piece to a shifting affect and to shifting moods, and this idea of loss of life and the question of mourning. I mean, it's something that's very palpable for probably everyone on this Zoom. And others thinking about the loss of life today in a time of COVID. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there to thank you for your commentary and your interpretation, because it really, his work to me takes on a totally different meaning now because of your interpretation in a time of COVID. So thank you very much for that.
Really, no, I appreciate that. And, I think AIDS and COVID are very different, but that there are these intersections and points of resonance. And I think, the mask is a really powerful symbol, right? Both of kind of disposability and production, but also, right, of how we relate to one another. It's a charged symbol that's not clear cut.
Yeah. So I think we're going to shift to questions now.
Yeah. So Nico, I've got a pretty interesting question here, which I hadn't thought of yet, but this is from Patrick, who is asking about the apple part of this particular piece, which the candy apple is a specific or regulated aspect of this particular piece, the green apple color, which we normally associate with green apple candy. So Patrick says, I can't help but think of biblical connotations without excluding other interpretations. Have you or anyone else thought about the relation of the apple in Genesis that Eve takes from the serpent and gives to Adam as pleasure and knowledge that comes at the cost of immortality and the grace of God? He says, grace seems like an intriguing alternative model for an economy, that which is given without being earned.
Interesting. I like it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And two, this sort of notion that you talked about in terms of cruel optimism, this sort of, or in reduced terms, just sort of a bittersweetness that when you take part in the piece, when you interact with the piece, there's this excitement, there's this kind of glow and attractiveness of the piece as you approach it, and the thought that you can actually touch and interact and take something from a work of contemporary art that is supposedly untouchable and highly valuable, and part of this canon of sort of elitist commerce, is very exciting. But it was funny because when Julie came to see it for the first time, I think she had that experience and she took a bite of one of the candies, experienced a very intense candy apple flavor, and then it quickly faded, where she was kind of stuck with the candy, right, Julie? Am I summarizing correctly? But it made me think that what you were talking about there with cruel optimism and this kind of bittersweetness, that it's not all just about this sort of childlike experience. The phenomenology that any viewer can experience can also tap into that moment where there's that sugar rush and it sort of fades away. So I wonder if you talk a little more about that in terms of how the viewer can experience that, even if they're not familiar with some of the terms of like cruel optimism and so forth.
Mm-hmm. I think you just did a really good job. I guess I wanted to go back to Patrick's comment to say that I didn't come across a lot of writing about this work in particular, Untitled LA. So for instance, Julie Alt edited this amazing anthology of writings and materials relating to Felix Gonzalez-Torres, and the Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation website provides a lot of texts that people can access. So I'd recommend going to both of those resources. But the work Untitled LA doesn't get analyzed specifically in the materials that I came across. So this question of the analysis of the flavor of the apple flavor is not something that I came across in what I was reading. So that might help to answer the fact that I don't think a lot of people have written about that aspect of the apple. Other candy pieces had other flavors, right, attached to them. I think John, you just did a really good job of analyzing the short, and also Julie, right, the kind of short time span of pleasure that we get from things, or from most things in our society, but they promise to give us what we want, but we have a come down afterwards, right? So Felix Gonzalez-Torres kind of, surprisingly, I think, compares that to patriotism with the work USA Today. So that's where I started. And, coming across this quotation and this kind of surprise from Bob Nickus in the interview saying, it's a mean piece? How could your work be mean, right? Because the generosity of the work has been so dominant in interpretations of an artist who would give people candies to take away and allow them to break the rules of ingestion and touching and all these things that museums normally don't let you do. But then a reading of the work as mean in relationship to that perceived generosity or that gesture of generosity is metaphorically materialized. I've been kind of dealing with this a lot. It's like, it's a metaphor, but it becomes material. So actually it's not a metaphor anymore. It's reality, which is maybe the materialism and the idealism that Ferguson is talking about, right, in the experience of the candy, right? Like, so John, as you describe it, right, people who may not have read Lauren Berlant Cruel Optimism know what it feels like to, have a candy that like goes cold in your mouth or whatever the expression would be, or, I thought this would taste good, but it actually leaves me feeling bitter or sour. And, one text that's featured in the affect theory reader that I was consulting a little bit in relationship to affect theory, which is not something I specialize in, has an analysis of taste. And I was hoping, oh yes, taste, he's going to talk about candies, but he's talking about taste as in refinement and connoisseurship, right? People have good taste and bad taste. And but he does mention in the text, this author in that book, that is this true? Don't test me on this, but that many flavors have an emotional or affective corollary. So the bitter, the sour, the sweet, right? That these things we associate with taste have come to represent these emotions, and that we can see Felix Gonzalez-Torres' work as linking them, as not focusing just on the thought of things being sour, the thought of things being sweet, the idea of things being sweet, but actually they are sweet, and those are linked in his work and in our experience of his work. So it's not just conceptual, it's sensory.
Yeah. So thinking about back to the idea of deregulation and regulation and manifesting the work, I have another question here from Andrew. He says, Nico, thanks for your presentation. I'm curious what you make of the aspect of regeneration that's integral to a work like Untitled LA and Felix Gonzalez-Torres' other candy works, and the fact that decisions around regeneration are responsibilities of an owner or exhibitor to consider for each manifestation of these works.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I was thinking about that in relationship to this specification of endless supply, and just like testing it, like what is the endless supply? So if we're talking about plastic, do we want to say, is it endless? What is the supply? Are we talking about nature? Are we thinking about resources? Are we talking about oil that the plastic is made from? This is Heather Davis's analysis of plastic I was mentioning. Are we talking about a fiction of endless supply? Can supply ever be endless? This becomes a practical problem for people like John and Julie, right? Like, will they keep making the candy? Will Dan Flavin's fluorescent tube still be made, right? Like, how do we interpret this if supply, in fact, isn't endless, right? Or, another way that people, have interpreted, like Scanlon, for instance, is the flexibility and fluidity of the work to regenerate. He reads in relationship to capitalism's kind of serpentine, to go back to Patrick's comment, ability to just fit its container and, take whatever shape it wants to, like the candy, pile can also, take whatever shape it wants to. But I don't guess that word regeneration, I don't know, Andrew, exactly, what that word's resonance is for you. I don't know entirely how to connect it to economics based on my knowledge of that word, but the question of endless supply and maybe putting pressure on that idea of endless supply is interesting for me, right? Not least in relationship to this kind of dialectic of mortality and immortality, or
and I just wanted to share with those of you here, I posted in the chat a link to the Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation page, where you can go and look at a lot of different variations of his candy works. some of which Nico showed this evening. But in reference to your question, Andrew, you can see a lot of art spaces that choose to do this differently. Like, for instance, and I was talking to Holly McHugh from the foundation the other day about how some curators will choose to keep, a very geometric, clean installation in place so that it always looks the same, where others, by the time the installation is over, it just sort of looks like this scattered mess all over the floor. And it's important to certain curators or art spaces philosophy that the space either degenerate or regenerate in a certain way. And so that was part of the flexibility or deregulation that Felix Gonzalez-Torres seemed to allow, and is what's sort of kept alive by continuing to manifest these works. But there's one more question here from Louis Chavez. Actually, we have several questions here. The question by Louis Chavez, with the idea of accessibility in mind, relating to the bountiful nature of this work, as well as the ubiquity of public billboard images, what's the role of a critic or curator in discussing or exhibiting the work to the public? Does Gonzalez-Torres ever speak to the intellectual accessibility of his work in the way that he is so generous with in the material aspect?
I feel like maybe, John, you should take the first part of that, right? Because I'm not a curator. But I think the intellectual generosity is these works are open to meaning, and and whatever meaning one brings to it. So I brought a lot of meanings from other people and from my own process, right? Like right, too much meaning, right? So can it hold all that meaning, right? Maybe not, but it's open to other people, right? Who might just pass the billboard on the street or take the candy and see it in a very different way. I would say, right? And there are these quotations from the artist saying, like, I want my work to appeal to a wide range of people. I think seeing children interact with his installations is a good example that it doesn't require, art historical training to have a relationship to this work. And in fact, probably it helps to not. But John, can I put you on the spot in terms of the first question about the role of the curator? And
yeah, sure. And I think, we're kind of manifesting that now. I mean, in a way, just because I think, but there's both ends of it. We can assign a lot of meaning to it, especially depending on what angle or facet of this you come from. And that was part of the beauty of the open-endedness of the work, because I think it can be, I say phenomenologically, but just sort of sensory experience can be had by a child, and they can sort of identify with some of those most basic elements that we talk about even in a more intellectual or academically informed way. And so it just depends on, how much we want to read into it or how open-ended we want to be about it. But in terms of the role of the curator in discussing or exhibiting it, I think it's about maintaining that open-endedness while keeping in mind some of the regulated parameters that Felix Gonzalez-Torres left behind, sort of these little clues and instructions about how to manifest the work. So I hope that answers your question, Louis. But if it doesn't.
Another reference point I want to throw out is a recent book called Models of Integrity by Joan Kee, K-E-E, an art historian, but who also is trained as a lawyer. And it's about kind of art and law, art and copyright, art and intellectual property since the 1960s, I think. So there's a chapter in the book dedicated to Felix Gonzalez-Torres' work, which could be an interesting place to look for more detail around the legality and legalese of these kind of rules to not follow rules, or, I think there is a combination, right? Like that one gives permission to not need permission.
Yeah, there's some really interesting legal angles in this work, the way it manifests the rights of ownership, the value of it, which is really fascinating. And I just want to remind everyone that we're going to continue discussions and panel discussions that may highlight some more of these issues. And we have 3 other programs coming up where we'll continue to draw out these issues, because I think all of them are important. There's a question here from Terry. I think she's asking me, did did I feel a great deal of pressure with the regeneration for our space? How did it make you feel to have this decision placed upon you? I wouldn't call it pressure. At the beginning, I think it's really a privilege to be able to work with a piece like this that allows the curator to almost collaborate with the artist, even though the artist is passed on. But because of the nature of the foundation and Art Bridges and their ability to kind of allow this piece to continue to manifest in different ways, it allows the curator to really collaborate with the original intention of the artist and interpret it for that particular space. And I think when I was talking to Holly, who's part of the foundation, Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation, she had mentioned that in particular, Untitled LA was supposed to respond to the architecture of the space. And that's one of the reasons we made the decision to put it in that triangular shape, because it allowed for a kind of volume and a presence, but it also allowed viewers to approach it a little bit more closely. And so I sometimes feel a little bit of pressure when I feel like, because I'm a little bit more of a obsessive compulsive when it comes to geometry. So if it gets messed up, I'm more feel pressure to go fix it. But I could also get down with the idea of just letting it become this amorphous mess also, if that's what we started with. But it was really a privilege to be able to make those decisions.
Because I was kind of wondering, like, are there a lot of curators who are like packing up all the candies, getting a scale out and being like, ooh, 2 pounds under, right? I doubt it, right? But it's fun to think. It's
true.
Yeah.
I think some of them were based on weight, like, some of the original weights, which were to mirror weights of human bodies, which, could be considered important for a curator to make that choice and say, this is supposed to be representative in terms of weight. But that's not really something that comes across to a viewer. I think the visual volume is what comes across to the viewer more immediately anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I think I would just add one piece to that, and that is that in terms of our conversations with Art Bridges and Crystal Bridges, which owns the piece, their measurements in terms of how to carry the piece out were very different. So one of the conversations that John and I had was about like what it might take to replenish, and that's based upon visitorship and how many people took the piece. So the metrics for this piece are very different than any piece I've ever worked with in my entire career. And it's about how many people you think will be coming to your exhibit and then how you can replenish it. And so you need to figure out if everyone takes one piece. It was just very different. And so adding that, for me, a mathematical element, is John and I sat there with pencil and paper trying to figure out the math of how many pounds to order, was just a very different interjection into the space of having John, as John rightfully put, the privilege of having this piece on view.
I'm not very good at math, but there was a part of me that wanted to analyze, right, in Felix Gonzalez-Torres' comments about the economic policy in the US at the time, like $1 for this, $6 for this, right? I don't know what that is, a fraction, a function, right? And then even like the titles are like untitled this, so it's like a function. So I thought maybe like this is 6 times this, and this is a function, exponential is 6, and then this isn't my skill set, but
secret code
by his interest in numbers in his analysis, because that's not how I think about these issues. And then we also have this specification of weight, which is also very particular.
Yeah, and we talked about this too a little bit before, Nico, about during a pandemic when foot traffic is a little bit slower and people are more hesitant to visit public spaces, but on top of that, hesitant to take something off the floor and then eat it. And does that change the nature of the work? And it certainly changes when Julie and I were thinking about how much candy we needed to order compared to when it's on display at Crystal Bridges. The foot traffic of Crystal Bridges, which is a destination, with thousands of people going through there. In some ways we're lucky we didn't have to think about that because we didn't anticipate it changing drastically in a short period of time. But especially with the pandemic where, less people visit it in person and less people actually get to experience that takeaway that was so important to the work. Does that change the nature of it or not? You know, when we're closed, if you've ever been down to City Art Space, it's actually, you can go inside the Sibley building and see into our space, even though we're closed. And so we've lit this piece 24/7. So you can go into the space even when we're closed and see it lit and have an encounter with it. You just can't approach it when we're closed. So I would have been interested to hear what Felix Gonzalez-Torres had to say in situations where you couldn't interact with it, you could only look at it, and what would that add or subtract from the meaning or the experience of the work. So we're getting close to rounding things down, I think, but I just want to throw it out there. If anyone has a question to add to our discussion here, feel free to put it in there. We can certainly take one or two more if you have one. While we're waiting on that possibility, I just want to remind all of you that there are more programs coming. In fact, there are 3 more programs coming up that are connected to this artist and work. The next one's actually on December 1st at 6 p.m., which will be a panel discussion. December 1st is World AIDS Day and Day Without Art. And so we invite you to join us for that panel discussion connecting Felix Gonzalez-Torres with global and local awareness of AIDS research and activism. We've got a great panel of guests for that, and you can check those out on our website and register for that talk. Of course, it's free at cityartspace.rit.edu. And that takes place December 1st. And then we've got another program in partnership with the Bass Museum in Florida, who's actually also hosting this work, Untitled LA, at their location, and honoring the 25th anniversary of Felix Gonzalez-Torres' death in January, which he actually passed away in Florida. So the Bass Museum will partner with us for an event in January, and then we'll have a closing panel in February. So we've got quite a bit of discussion and facets of Felix Gonzalez-Torres to talk about with this work. And so I just want to thank again Art Bridges and Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, Julie Decker, and Stephanie Rankin, Aaron Garland, and most of all, Dr. Nico Vicario, for sharing your expertise and your perspective with us tonight. We really appreciate you being with us.
It was fun.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. If you're on our website, sign up for our email list if you haven't already. You'll receive reminders of upcoming events and programs. Follow us on social media at RIT City Art Space and stay connected with us there. But until then, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.